think of what's happening in the world today in the Middle East, you clearly are seeing the effects of this diffusion of power. The conventional wisdom used to be that when you looked at a place like Egypt, we had no choice. We either supported the autocrat like Mubarak, or we were stuck with the religious extremists like the Muslim Brotherhood. There was nothing else. But if you look what happened over the last 30 years or so, the middle filled in. The huge amounts of information that are available helped create a middle of the political spectrum in Egypt. And what's more, the new information technologies, like Twitter or Facebook, allowed these people to coordinate with each other. And this meant that suddenly you had a new politics in places like Egypt and Tunisia. Or if you want to take another case, you can think of WikiLeaks. In the past, you could steal government documents as a spy. You could put them in a briefcase and pull them out. You could leak them to the New York Times or whatever. So that's not new. But what's new is the idea that somebody can suddenly release 250,000 State Department cables dealing with our relations around the world all at once. I mean, that is quite different. You might call that Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, a super empowered individual who can do so much so easily. Or take spying more generally and think of the issues of cyber and cybersecurity, which I have a chapter on in my book. In the past, you could think of sending a spy into the US, stealing some secrets from a company or from the government, packing them up in the briefcase, getting out. There was a certain danger to that. You could be caught, you could be put on trial. Now, you could sit somewhere overseas and send electrons into the United States, and you can exfiltrate truckloads of information, not briefcase loads, and nobody quite knows who did it. You know, this famous New Yorker cartoon of two dogs talking to each other. One dog says to the other, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Well, unfortunately, there's something in that. We are using information, and we don't always know who is taking it. And that is a very different world. So the information revolution has empowered non-state actors to play on the stage of international politics, this diffusion of power, and we're only just beginning to learn how to think about this. What that means is that we're going to need to think much more clearly about power than we have in the past. In the past, when we think about power, our tendency as Americans is usually to think of military power. Military power is important. There's a whole chapter in my book on military power. But it's not all of power in international politics. The famous Oxford historian A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote a book called The Struggle for Mastery of Europe in the 19th century, said that the mark of a great power is the ability to prevail in war. But you know, in an information age like today, it's not just whose army wins, it's also whose story wins. And that means that when you deal with things like demonstrators in Tahrir Square, it's not just your military capacity, it's the story, the narrative that we tell that makes us attractive or not to those generations of the future. So you think, what do we mean by power? Power is simply the ability to affect others to get what you want. Pretty simple. You do it three ways. You can threaten people with coercion. You can pay them with bribes, carrots, or you can attract them and persuade them to want what you want. And it's that third thing that I call soft power. The ability to get what you want without coercion or payment, without carrots and sticks. If you can attract people and persuade them, you can save a lot on carrots and sticks. And the ability to combine hard power of coercion, payment, military and economic power, with soft power of attraction and persuasion. Combining those is what I call smart power, or a strategy of smart power. Now, we have not been very good at talking about this in our country. I remember talking to a friend of mine, a woman who was a member of Congress, and she said, well, you know, you're absolutely right about soft power, but I can't stand up on a political platform and talk about it. I can't say we need more money for the State Department. I can say we need more money for the Pentagon. And when you talk to voters, we still are thinking very much in old-fashioned terms, as though hard military power were the only answer. But if you think about the world today, you can say, how can I deal with cyber crime, as I just described? I don't see what role military power has in that. How do I deal with climate change? You can't go and bomb Chinese coal plants that are producing CO2. So essentially, the world is changing, but our thinking about the world has not changed as rapidly as the world has changed. And that means that we're going to have to develop a more sophisticated way of thinking about power than the way we talk about it now, if we're to develop these smart power strategies, which will allow us to succeed in the century in which we're now 1/10 of the way through. Now let me return back to this question of power transition, which is the shift of power not from governments to non-state actors, but from one set of states to another state, what I call the rise or recovery of Asia. Very often when people look at the world today and notice this shift, they use another old-fashioned narrative or story to explain what's going on. They say it's American decline. That this is, you know, the Americans are going the way of Rome or Victorian Britain or whatever. That's not very helpful, in my opinion, in terms of understanding what's really happening. It's worth noticing that in the 18th century, Horace Walpole, who's a British statesman, looked at what had happened to Britain after the United States colonies had declared independence and said, woe is Britain. We are now going to decline to a miserable little island like Sardinia or Denmark. Of course, he missed the fact that Britain was on the eve of its even greater century of power, which was created by the Industrial Revolution. So we can often make mistakes if we think that we know where a country is in the cycle of its lifespan. When you look at a human being, you can pretty much get an idea of where they are in the cycle of their lifespan. I regret to inform you, if you haven't already observed it, I'm in decline. But if you look at a nation, you can't make that prediction. Because nations or countries don't have fixed lifespans. Take Rome. A lot of people say, you know, we're like the decline of Rome. Well, it's worth remembering that Rome lasted for 3 centuries after it reached the peak of its power. So we don't know where America is in its life cycle. Some people say the 20th century, or Henry Luce, in fact, proclaimed the 20th century to be the American century. And they say the 21st century is the Chinese century. I'm not so convinced by that. But in any case, nobody knows. Now, it is true that many Americans and many Chinese think they know. There's a widespread view in this country now that the United States is in decline. Public opinion polls show that the majority of the people. And there's even another view, which polls show, which say that China is larger than the US, larger in economic terms. That's simply false. I mean, the second statement is simply false. We're 3 times larger than the Chinese economy, and 10 times richer per capita. But the question of you know, is there a decline of the United States? There are 2 things to notice about this. One is that Americans go through belief that we're in decline every decade or 2. And this isn't new. In the 1950s, after Sputnik, we thought the Soviets were 10 feet tall. In the 1980s, when we ran up big budget deficits, we thought the Japanese were 10 feet tall. Today, after the financial crisis of 2008, where we're suffering from unemployment above 9% still, we think the Chinese are 10 feet tall. So I wouldn't worry too much about what the current public opinion polls show. They tell you more about American psychology than they tell you about the reality of facts on the ground. The other problem with this, this narrative of decline is it confuses two different things. One is absolute decline, and the other is relative decline. Rome went through absolute decline. Basically, what happened to Rome was internal decay, an economy that wasn't growing, terrible corruption and decay, and Rome fell not because of the rise of another country that replaced it, or empire that replaced it. It fell to a horde of barbarians. That is absolute decline. If you look at the world today, I don't think you can make a case that the Americans are in absolute decline. What you can make a case for is that Asia, for reasons I gave earlier, is catching up. So the gap of our power, let's say measured by economics, and that of China, India, and others, is diminished. Now you can